Hi, I'm Rick. I lead the River Church in Newcastle. This week we're going to take a little break from our Acts series, but we're going to stay with the same author as my friend Tim Suffield brings us a message from Luke's Gospel. Tim is a member of King's Church in Birmingham, and he and his wife Helen are very good friends of mine and Cheryl, and we're so pleased that King's and the River Church are in the same family of churches, Grace Connection. Tim is a wonderful Bible scholar and has a fantastic prophetic voice, so I know he'll have a really great message for us this morning. I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you soon.
Hello River Church, it is wonderful to be with you. I would dearly love to be able to travel and be with you in person, and we hope that one day we're able to do that in the fairly near future, but at the moment it's great to be with you in this slightly strange way nonetheless. This morning we are going to be looking at Luke chapter 7, so that's one of the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life. And we're going to be looking together at a story of when Jesus encountered a woman and her son and totally changed both of their lives. So I'm going to read to you from Luke chapter 7, I'm going to be starting at verse 11. If you've got a Bible with you, it will, I think, help you to follow along as well. Soon afterwards, this is Jesus, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up. We'll come back to that. The dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him was spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. So Jesus is travelling with a great crowd following him, as often happened in his ministry, and arrives at a small town called Nain. There would have been something like 200 people living there. And as he and the crowd come, they find a funeral procession going on. Most of the town gathering to join with a widow whose son has died earlier that day, and they've wrapped him carefully and placed him on a plank of wood, and they're now carrying him outside of the town in order to be buried. And it would probably have been a strange scene. Nain is a very little place. There would almost certainly have been more people in Jesus' crowd than in the funeral procession. And Jesus stops, and he stops the crowd and his disciples, and he watches what's going on and takes in the scene, and very quickly understands the situation and has great compassion on the woman. And we discover that the way of life is encountering the procession of death. And we're told he's a widow's son, which means that his mother, the woman that Jesus has compassion on, would have been culturally orphaned. She, at least in her culture, would need a man to be able to earn money in order to feed her. And her husband would have been doing that, but he's died previously. And then her sons would do that for her. But she only has the one son, and he's just died. So the town grieves with her, but they're not in a position to help. Most of them will be barely getting by themselves. This is not a place where there's any sort of welfare state or government support available for people. Instead, they could do little more than stand by her side, knowing that her outlook is bleak. and that her own death, whether literally or just in the sense of her life becoming smaller and more meagre as she tries to find things to live on, is following after her, much as they follow after the dead body of her son. And then Jesus takes the initiative. He comes over and he says, "Stop crying," which we have to catch his tone. He's not being brusque, he's being gentle. He's encouraging her that she doesn't need to cry because the Lord of the New Age is going to do something different. And he's trying to comfort her in her pain, in her difficulty. He sees her and he knows her situation and he's going to do something about it. And then he approaches the man, which is a verb in Greek which is only ever used in Luke's Gospel when Jesus is going to do something in power. It's a verb of power, it's a verb of action, which, just as a side note, is wonderfully good news. Whenever Jesus approaches someone, he acts, much like he's going to act for the widow and for her son. So he approaches the man, and then verse 14, he came up and he touched the bier, that's the plank of wood. He touches the plank and essentially touches the dead body or just next to it, which to our ear might sound a bit icky, a bit unpleasant perhaps, dead body perhaps disgusting, not something that we want to get near. But most of us don't encounter dead bodies very much. I was reflecting on this. I've never seen a dead human body. I suspect that's true of most of us. We're very unusual in the history of humanity, or even in the world today, for that to be the case. I've probably not seen a dead body of anything much larger than maybe a fox by the side of the road. We have a cat, so I'm quite used to dealing with dead rodents and having to hold them and dispose of them, but I've not touched anything much larger than a very small animal that would fit in the palm of my hand that's dead. And so to us it's sort of like, oh, dead, disgusting. But quite a different connotation in Jesus' culture. For them, to touch a dead body defiles you spiritually. And that's because the logic behind Jewish purity laws, maybe if you've read the Bible a little, you come across some laws in the Old Testament about what the Jewish people were allowed to eat or not eat, or do or not do, that made them pure or impure. The laws all work on the logic that when you touch or eat something, you become like it. So if you touch a dead body, its death transfers to you, that you become dead spiritually. And so you're not able to enter into the life of the people of Israel or enter into God's presence until something has happened to bring you alive again spiritually. So for Jesus to do this, this is harmful to him. This is dangerous for him. But instead of Jesus receiving death, he gifts life. And you see, friends, what I really want you to understand today more than anything else is that Jesus is not afraid to touch you. He's not afraid to touch you. Much like he's not afraid to touch this young man's dead body despite seeming risk to himself and change everything in an instant. He is not afraid to touch you. Now, it might sound odd on the ear in the time of COVID when we're told not to touch anyone and to stay away. But Jesus is not afraid to touch you. And not just the good obvious parts of you and your inside and your spirit and your heart, not just the parts that you quite like being on show, not just the parts that we get to see maybe in a church gathering, not just the parts that other Christians get to know about, but the deepest and the darkest and the most dead parts of you. Jesus is not afraid to touch you. Because you see, we're not so different from this young man, and we're not so different from Jesus' culture. We don't think of it like this, but it's the same for us as it would be for him. When we touch dead things, we die too. That's what we call sin. When we touch things that are spiritually dead, when we do, think and feel things that God says are not the way of Jesus, are not the way of life, we find that spiritually we die. And yet Jesus is the one who is not afraid to enter into your deepest and your darkest and your lowest places and touch you. And what happens when Jesus touches you? Well, verse 15, and the dead man sat up. I mean, there's a world in those 5 words. Just sit with that for a minute. I mean, if you know the Bible, you're like, great, Jesus meets a dead person, they get up, they walk off, that's what happens. Just sit with the surprise of it for a moment. I was preaching on this passage a couple of weeks ago, and we had some plasterers in our house that Sunday. We're renovating our home, and they were asking me what was going on. I was kind of explaining it'd be helpful if they weren't too noisy between a particular period, and they were asking what I was going to be speaking on, and I started telling them this story. And I just kind of outlined it in a few sentences. They were intrigued, and I got to the bit where the young man sat up. And the plasterer looked me straight in the face and gave an expression of surprise that I will not be repeating, but I thought was really appropriate. Actually, he got it. This is surprising. This is shocking. This is not what we would expect to happen. The dead man sat up. Jesus is not afraid to touch you, and his touch brings life. And he restores the son to life, and in so doing restores the widow's fortune. And he can do the same for you today. Actually reach to the darkest, the deepest, the smelliest, the most disgusting part of your heart and bring life. He's not afraid to touch you. He's not bothered by the stink. Doesn't hold his nose when he opens his arms to us. He says, come with all your mess, all your difficulty. Come with all your sin. Come with all your failings. Come with all your death and your stink and your decay, and be embraced by the mighty Lord of all and find that everything changes. In fact, the place that Jesus loves you most is the place you would most like him not to go. The place in your heart you most don't want him to see. It is honestly the place that he is most delighted with you, the place that he is most for you. It has nothing to do with what it's like there, but he loves you, and he comes to change everything that he touches. He approaches, he touches, he speaks, and nothing is the same ever again. You see, what we learn from the widow is that Jesus is for the defenseless and for the desolate. He's for the weak and for the widowed. He's for the alone and for the abandoned. He's for sinners and he's for sufferers. And that means he's for you and he's for me. Dear friends, he's not afraid to touch you, and his touch always brings life. Even this morning, Jesus can and indeed will come to you and bring life against the death that is present in this world, life against the death that is in our hearts, because when we don't follow the way of Jesus, life against the death that we embrace when we make life about ourselves, and instead gift you new life, whether you know him before or not, gift you new life and change everything in an instant. Wow. He is such a good God. And then this passage, I mean, that's the story, that's what happens, that's what we learn about Jesus, but there's a couple of things we might miss on the face of it. I think reading the Bible is sometimes a little bit like watching an American sitcom that you don't quite get. don't know if you've ever had that experience. You're watching a comedy program and there are jokes, and you can sort of tell that they're jokes because of the timing and the reaction of the characters, even if there's no laugh track. But you don't quite get it because you don't know who the people are, you don't get the cultural reference, or somehow it doesn't quite translate well enough, even if we speak the same language. And you think, I know that was meant to be funny, but I didn't find it funny and I didn't really get it. I feel a bit like I'm missing what's going on. Sometimes reading the Bible's a bit like that. I don't know if you've ever kind of felt that. You're like, I kind of get it. I get it at one level, but I'm missing the references. I'm not catching everything that's going on. And if you've ever felt like that, you're right. And if you haven't felt like that, I suspect we're missing some of the layers that the text has for us. So there are two echoes in this passage that Luke has written in deliberately, that happened and then Luke wrote in, of the rest of Scripture, the rest of the Bible, that Luke really wants us to notice because he's trying to tell us a few things. So the first is that we're explicitly told that this is the mother's only son. And we're told it's her only son because it was, and that's her situation. And we're told it's her only son because what happens in this story is that the only son is raised from death to life. The phrase only son in Scripture always means both what it seems to mean in the story and also points towards the only Son of God, Jesus. The one who died and then was raised to life by the Spirit of God. Which means that as we read this, as Jesus knows where he's going, he's on the way towards the cross and resurrection, God is promising us that the only Son will be raised. How is it that this man can have the bravery and the confidence to touch death, knowing that it can't touch him back, but instead he will defeat it with merely a word? How can he? Because he's the only Son who will be raised. And then the second echo. Now the people caught this one, and so Luke kind of lets us in on it a bit, because they say, oh, a great prophet has arisen amongst us. That's verse 16. That's how the crowd react, because they've caught something. They know it, they know the Old Testament, they know Israel's story, and they've caught a reference. And so they say, a great prophet has arisen, or the Greek could also be a new prophet has arisen, like the one that was promised. What are they thinking of? Because I don't know if that would have been my first reaction. I kind of get, yes, God's come and he's visited his people, but why a great prophet? Well, they're thinking, two prophets in the Bible, they're thinking of Elijah and Elisha, who we meet in 1 and 2 Kings in the Old Testament, both of whom encounter a widow, both of whom witness or are around when the widow's son dies, and both of whom then raise the widow's son from death. Which means the crowd are thinking, hang on, it's a bit like Elijah and Elisha. Maybe this is the great prophet that we're told would come who'd be better than Moses. Maybe this is him. It's the one who is promised. Certainly it's one a little bit like them. And Luke wants us to catch that, and he wants us to see that there are a few differences between the stories of Elijah, Elisha, and Jesus. First difference, Jesus took initiative. Elijah and Elisha both had to be explicitly asked by the widow to come and do something about her son. They didn't step forward, but Jesus, he doesn't hang back. He doesn't need to be requested. He runs and fixes the problem. He runs and touches death, and death loses. When Elijah raised the widow's son, he had to speak 3 times and do 3 actions. When Elisha raised the widow's son, he spoke twice and took 2 actions. Jesus touches, says one thing, get up, the word arise, and the young man gets up and finds himself back to life. And then there's a link in the next section of Luke to the prophet Elijah. Starts to talk about John the Baptist, and who was the one who went before Jesus, who the scriptures, Luke and the other Gospels, have already connected explicitly to Elijah. And so we're supposed to be thinking, hang on, it's one of these 2 prophets, not Elijah, but Elisha, the one who followed him. And why Elisha? Well, what do we know about Elisha? Well, he did lots of things like raising a widow's son, but there's a story about him, that happened after his death. Quite surprising. Elisha is buried. He's put in his tomb. And then two men start having a fight outside of his tomb, and one of them is killed by the other, and he falls backwards into the tomb, and he lands on the bones, and he is completely resurrected back to life. His dead body is thrown onto some bones and comes back to life. Elisha's death brings life to others. Which means that, to put it all together, what is Luke trying to show us? That there is a new prophet who was promised in the Old Testament, who has now come. That his death, like Elisha's, will bring life. And that the only son will be raised. He's trying to tell us the whole gospel. As in, how is it that it is possible that Jesus can reach out into our darkest and our deepest places, touch them, meet our sin head on, and yet bring life? How is it? Luke lays it out for us. Because he's the one who will go to the cross on our behalf. Because he's the one who will be raised from death to life. Wow. Wow. And you see, in the resuscitation of the man, hope breathes into our own lives, because the same can happen to us spiritually. In the unexpected free gift given to the widow of her life back, there is an unmerited gift of life offered to each of us. And in Jesus' fearless touching of dead flesh, we see his fearless touching of our hearts and of our sin. Jesus is for you. He's for sinners, people like you and I, who do things we shouldn't, who don't follow the way of Jesus, who break the law of God, who don't live lives that are good for us, and yet says that he will come very specifically to the places of our hearts where things are at their worst, and he will change them for good. And he's the one who comes to sufferers, ones whose lives are in great difficulty, not because of things that they've done, but simply something has happened and everything has been upended, whether big or small. And I'm sure you've all been there to some extent, also for you. Whether it's your fault or not, basically. He's the one who comes to give life. And he promises that he will give us life, even this morning. And it must feel, friends, in these bizarre days that we live in, when we're kind of shut off in some ways from church as we would know it, that there's no life to be had, that there's no hope to be had. And yet the river, I must tell you, there is always hope with Jesus. There is always life with Jesus. He has specific things for you, even this morning as you are watching this. Some time after I've recorded it, I know firmly that he has life for you as a church. Yes, for individuals. Yes, freedom from sin. Yes, rescue from suffering. Yes, new hope, new life in your hearts. But as a church, there is life for you in the Spirit that he offers to you. He is not afraid to touch you. You might feel, the team particularly that have gone up, you might feel very alone. He is for you. He is with you. Others who are joining, oh, what a joy. He is for you. He is with you. And he always, always will be. Wow. Isn't he wonderful? I really love him. Jesus, we ask that you would come to us with fresh life and fresh hope and fresh wonder. That you would help us right now bring to you the deepest and darkest parts of our hearts, the parts that we don't want you anywhere near because of the smell. And then, Lord, would you rush to us? And I know that you will. Would we find, in fact, that you are already there, that that is where you have camped yourself, that that is where you have arranged yourself, and that you are for us and with us and ready to speak and bring life. Thank you, Mighty One.